Great. So thank you for clicking on my talk. The title of my talk is Consensus and Compromise in Collective Choice. And what I'm going to do is I'm first going to state the kind of question I'm interested in. I'm going to say what I want to say about it, and then I'm going to lead you through the argument. Okay, so the kinds of situations I'm interested in this talk are ones in which we have a group of agents who are deeply divided about some issue. They have certain options before them, and they're going to have to make a collective choice about which of those options to pick collectively. And more precisely, I'm interested in compromise, in particular whether groups, sort of polarized groups, have, in some sense, like a reason, a good collective reason to choose the compromise option, even though they're deeply divided. And there are various reasons why a group might have reasons to compromise. I want to set a couple aside, and in order to focus even more specifically on the kind of case I'm interested in. So one reason when I think a group has a reason to compromise is if each of the members cares about compromising for its own sake. So it might be that you're the kind of person who likes to see yourself as an agreeable person, and you value compromising and giving a little for the sake of others. I want to set those cases aside. So I want to imagine that the group of agents none of the members of the group care about compromising for its own sake. Instead, they just care about getting the things they most prefer, and they prefer, and the group disagrees about which thing they most prefer. Another reason that groups might have to compromise are instrumental reasons. So you might think, I don't care about compromising for its own sake, but I do care about, getting the stuff that I want, and I am going to interact as a member of this group, face many different decisions going forward. And so I have instrumental reasons to compromise now, to give up a little bit of what I might want now, because I think that might be best in achieving my goals in the future. Because if I give up a little now, you got to give a little to get a little. You'll compromise in the future on certain issues, and that'll be best. I want to set those issues aside as well. So let's imagine that this is a group that has formed sort of ex nihilo, and they're going to make this one decision, and then they will likely never see each other ever again. So a bit more concretely, let me give you the case. It's still somewhat abstract, but the thought will be we'll have a group of agents. There'll be three options they can choose from: A, B, and C. A sizable portion of the group they're the A'ers. They prefer A most of all. That's their favorite option. They hate B. B is their least favorite option out of the three, and C is in between. The other sort of subgroup of the group, they're the B'ers. They prefer B most of all. They do not like A. And again, C, the compromise option, is somewhere in between. And I want to make a distinction between two different ways that C could be the compromise option. There's actually several different ways C could be the compromise option, but I'm going to focus on two. So the first is where C is everyone's second favorite choice. So the A'ers prefer A most of all. B, they like the least. C, they only prefer slightly less to A. Whereas the B'ers, they prefer B most of all. They don't like A, but they prefer C only slightly less than B, their top choice. One way that I propose that we're going to sort of operationalize this idea of it being their second favorite is that everybody would prefer the compromise option, C, to a 50-50 gamble between A and B. Okay, so that's the first one where everyone regards C as their sort of second, it's the second favorite compromise. C is everyone's second favorite choice. The other situation I want to talk about is one where C is everyone's second least favorite. It's not their least favorite, but it's their second least favorite. It comes almost last. So this would be a case in which the A'ers, they prefer A most of all, B is their least favorite choice, and C is just slightly better than B. And for the B'ers, it's reversed. B is their favorite choice, A is the worst, and C is just slightly better than A. And the way to operationalize this is to say everyone prefers that 50-50 gamble between A and B to the compromise option, C. So maybe in the first case, we'll call it C+. That's like the compromise that everyone prefers to the gamble. And the second case, we'll refer to the compromise option as C- because everyone prefers the gamble to the compromise option. Of course, there's other cases in between, or the other one in between is one where some people regard the compromise option to be their second favorite, but other people in the group regard it to be their second least favorite. I'm just going to, for the moment, set those cases aside and just sort of focus on the pure cases where there's consensus that the compromise option is second best in the first case, and in the second case, everyone agrees, there's consensus that the compromise option is second worst. Okay, so what I want to say, or the question I'm interested in, and then what I want to say about it is there some reason for groups like this to choose the compromise option? Is there ever a situation in which there's some sense of ought in which they ought to choose the compromise option? It would be wrong of them to not choose the compromise option, given, like I said before, that it's not that anyone cares about compromising of its own for its own sake. It's not that there's these instrumental reasons having to do with future decisions with the group to privilege the compromise option. Is there some reason, just in this one-off decision, where we think you ought to choose the compromise option? And if so, what are the circumstances and what are the conditions? And what I want to do in the rest of the time here is to give an argument that says, the argument is going to say that in the cases where the compromise option is C+, where it's everyone's second favorite choice, that the group ought to compromise. It would be wrong of them to pick A or B. Instead, what they ought to do is they ought to pick the compromise option. But in the case where it's C-, where it's everyone's second least favorite, the group ought to not pick C. They ought to rule that out and then somehow decide between A and B themselves. And the argument is going to rely on sort of two baskets of assumptions. So the first basket of assumptions I'm going to call these sort of rationality principles. So I'm going to assume that all the members of the group are rational, and it's basically what that assumption amounts to is that they're instrumentally rational in the sense of decision theory. They obey expected utility theory. So they assign values to the final ends that they care about. They assign credences to the things they're uncertain about, and they take the options that maximize expected value. Okay, so making some heavier duty assumptions, though, I'm also going to, I don't take these to be actually like tenets of rationality, but to sort of just delimit the problem I'm interested in, I'm going to assume that the agents don't care about the ways in which they receive the goods in question, that all they care about are, A, B, and C, and how they rank those things. They don't care about whether they receive A through this procedure or that procedure or whatnot. And so one of the consequences of making these assumptions is that we can think of the group, the propositions about the group deciding between some options as akin to gambles. So, for example, if the group knows it's going to go and face a choice between two options, and the members of the group are not sure what the results will be of the group deciding between those things, the members of the group will treat that decision, they'll value the group facing that decision like a gamble between the the various things that might result from them facing that decision. So more concretely, suppose that they think we're going to go face a choice between A and B. I don't know what we're deeply divided about A and B. I don't know what the group will end up deciding if we choose A and B. I think that when there's no consensus, it's going to basically be like a coin flip. We haven't established how we'll adjudicate these kinds of these conflicts. And so for sort of principle of indifference type reasons, assign 50-50 chance to us selecting A over B. I'll treat the proposition that the group faces a choice between A and B as like a 50-50 gamble between A and B. Okay, so the first basket of assumptions, those rationality assumptions, essentially that's what they get us. I'm going to sort of skim past them here on the handout, skip to the next basket of assumptions, which are legitimacy assumptions. So the idea here behind these legitimacy assumptions are that in order for a group's decision to be legitimate, it has to be that the procedure that they used to pick the group has to be legitimate. And in order for that procedure to be legitimate, it has to be that either it was selected through a procedure that was legitimate, or there has to be some consensus. So let me give like a little bit of a story to kind of bring out the idea. It's a story that was told to me about a faculty meeting that had gone wrong, where there was a faculty meeting. The faculty was deciding some issue they'd never faced before, and the majority wanted to do one thing, but there was a vocal minority who very much did not want to do that thing. I don't know what the thing was, but you can fill in your own details. So the majority they took a vote. Majority won, and they were going to move on from the issue. And one of the members of the vocal minority piped up and said, "Well, wait a minute, hold on. Why are we taking this as a settled matter?" And someone responded, "Well, we took a vote." And he said, "Well, we never decided that we would vote on matters like this. This is a novel issue for us. We never, it's not written into the bylaws or anything that we vote, we do majority rules on matters of this sort. So I don't see how it's fair that like we've just, where did this come from? So we need to establish some procedure for deciding matters like this first before we can take this to be a settled matter." So the group debated this, and they decided that one of the proposals was to use majority rules to decide matters of this sort. And they said all in favor, and the same people who voted on the first order issue for the thing, the same majority voted to use majority rules on these issues. The vocal minority voted against it. And again, they took it to be a settled matter, but again, the same member of the vocal minority spoke up and said, "Well, wait a minute, we never decided that we'd use majority rules to decide these procedural questions in this domain." And the faculty meeting lasted for a long time, and they never reached consensus. And I think, although there's an insight, I think the member of the vocal minority there's something right about that. It's annoying, but maybe an annoyingly correct thing, which is that there's something not legitimate about appealing to majority rules in these kinds of cases, or just taking it to be clear that one of these procedures is right without there being some independent justification for it. And so that's what the legitimacy assumption here says. It says, look, if there's going to be disagreement about the procedures that we use to decide the first order issue, then that becomes a disagreement that arises at the second order, and that needs to be made. It has to be a legitimate thing at the second order as well. Now, it might be that, as it sounds like in this case, you just get a regress. So, which is why maybe it's important to have like a constitution or have something settled in advance before we are facing the first order decisions, that we say, look, we don't know what decisions we're going to face in the future. We have to say in advance what procedures we'll use. But if it's a group that just formed, we don't have a constitution yet, we haven't said anything about this to begin with, we're stuck in this sort of difficult issue of legitimacy, where if you can predict that deciding this procedural question will ultimately decide the first order question, the disagreement about the first order question then becomes a disagreement about the second order question. Okay. You might worry this will just lead to a regress. What I'm going to suggest here at the end of this talk, though, is that given some of these other assumptions I'm going to make clear, that in this case, these cases with these compromise options, there will not be a regress. That instead, the group, when it's facing a first order question, whether to choose A, B, or C, that will lead to a disagreement about which procedures it should use to decide that first order question. That might lead to a third order disagreement about what procedures to use to decide which procedures to use to set the agenda to decide the first order question. That itself might go up, but it will not regress forever. And instead, what I'm going to suggest or argue is that actually will terminate at consensus. And there will be consensus. And in the first case, there'll be consensus that the group ought to pick C+. They will all prefer choosing this sort of meta procedure that will ultimately result in them winding up with the compromise option. And that is what they will prefer to all of the other options at the table at that stage. And in the other case where we have C-, the group will reach consensus that all the procedures that are left on the table that they disagree about, none of them will result in C-. And so it would not be legitimate to choose C-. Okay, so now just to quickly sort of go through the idea, let me skip down to the different methods I have in mind here. So the thought is when choosing between three options, there are these different procedures we could use. I'm going to talk about two of the different procedures. And then for each of those procedures, there's different ways of setting the agenda. And setting the agenda in this case is going to matter. So the first way I'm going to talk about is we'll call it the process of elimination. Here's how it works. What you do when you have three options is you just focus in on one of the options and we say, do we want to accept this option or do we want to reject it? If you accept it, then that's over. You've chosen one of the three. If you reject it, then you know you'll go on and face a choice between the other two options. So for example, suppose we're going to focus in on the compromise option. We say, do we as a group want to choose the compromise option, or do we want to go on and choose between, reject it and then go on and choose between the remaining options, A and B? Well, let's just fill out the rest of the story. Suppose that the group was going to structure their deliberation in this way. What would the group do? Well, here's what I'm proposing. Given the rationality assumptions and the legitimacy assumptions, the group would say, okay, I know we're deeply divided about the matter of A and B. Roughly half of us want A, roughly half of us want B. So were we to reject C, the compromise option, we'd go on to face a choice between A and B. I don't know what we'd wind up choosing because we're deeply divided about this. For principle of indifference type reasons, then I'd say, look, it's kind of like a 50-50 coin toss between getting A and B. We have never settled how we settle matters like this, so regard this to be basically just a 50-50 shot between the two. And so I can think of us going on to decide between A and B, that decision, that group decision, as like a gamble between A and B. But I prefer C, in the first case where it's C plus, to the 50-50 gamble. And so I would prefer us to just accept C outright rather than to reject it and go on and face between A and B. And that's true of everyone in the group because everybody, we're supposing in that first case, prefers the compromise option C plus to the 50-50 gamble between A and B. Okay. Now, I, in this case, set the agenda in one way where we focus in on C. There's three ways to set the agenda. One is where we focus in on C and decide whether we reject that or not. One where we focus in on A and decide whether to reject A or accept it. And one where we focus in on B, reject it and accept it. As it turns out, how you set the agenda really matters because in that first case, the one where we focus in on C, we saw that we got a result that everyone, there's consensus, everyone would say, no, let's go for C. In the case where we focus in on A, though, there'll be disagreement between whether we should accept A. The A'ers think we should accept A, but the B'ers think, no, we should reject it and go on and decide between C and B. And the reverse is true if we focus in on B. So what the results are going to depend on how you set the agenda. And so we'll have a disagreement that arises at the second order level. And I'll come back to that in a second. Let me say what the next procedure is as well, though. There's another procedure for deciding, taking three options and deciding between them. And that's a tournament method. So that would be one where, to use this little diagram here, where you take two options at random. The third one gets a bye into the next round, but you focus in on two of the options and you say, if we were just choosing between these two, what would we want? And then whichever the winner is goes on to face the third option that got a bye into the next round. So you could say, well, first we'll start out with A and B and we'll say, which out of the two do we want to choose? And whichever one we decide between then goes on and faces C. So suppose to A and B, we end up being like, all right, fine, we'll choose B. Then B goes on and faces off between B and C, and we choose between B and C. Again, there's three different ways to set the agenda for this procedure because we can have one where C gets the bye into the next round, or we can have the one where A gets a bye into the next round, or the one where B gets a bye into the next round. Now, let me just sort of skip to the results here at the very end. So what will end up happening in the case where it's C plus is that because how you set the agenda matters, that first order, the legitimacy assumption plus that first order disagreement will turn into a second order disagreement about how to set the agenda. So there'll be a disagreement about whether we should use the elimination method and focus in on C, or whether we should use the tournament method and focus in on A, or whether we should use the elimination method and focus in on B and whatnot, so on and so forth. But everyone will agree that if we were to choose the one where we focus, the elimination method where we focus in on C, that we should choose C rather than going on and deciding between A and B alone, because they prefer C to the gamble between A and B. That second order disagreement about how to set the agenda and what procedure to use will transform into a third order disagreement about which procedure to use, because again, we can use the elimination method and the tournament method at that higher order level to decide which of those procedures or agendas to use, and so on and so forth. But because of that fact about if we use the elimination method where C, everyone prefers C to the gamble, that will keep sort of ramifying through these higher orders, and eventually there will be agreements where there'll be one path through, one sort of procedure to pick a procedure to pick a procedure, whatever, that will result in C. And there'll be lots of other procedures that people will think, I don't know if it's going to result in A or B or C or whatnot. But at some point, the value they assign to C, so the procedure that will ultimately result in C, that value will outweigh the values they assign to the other very complicated procedures that might result in A, might result in B, and might result in C in various probabilities. Essentially, to peel back the curtain a little bit, the mathematical fact is that as we ascend up these levels, the other procedures, their values ever approach the value of the gamble between A and B. And because everyone prefers C to the gamble between A and B, at some level, this procedure will terminate and there'll be consensus. And people will say, we all prefer this one procedure to pick the procedure to pick the procedure to pick the procedure that will definitely result in C to any of the other complicated procedures on offer. So that's what's true for the case where everyone prefers C to the gamble, the case where C is everyone's second favorite. It's a good compromise. Sort of the reverse happens when C is everyone's least favorite, when it's C minus. In that case, what happens is the procedures that result in C minus get eliminated, and everyone at some point will just prefer any of the other procedures to the ones that result in C minus. Okay, so the conclusion, just to wrap up, I'm a little over time, but to wrap up, the conclusion here is that if you buy these sort of assumptions I'm making, that is even groups who are self-interested, they don't care about compromise for their own sake, they're just facing a one-off decision. If we impose these certain legitimacy constraints and assume a certain amount of assume these rationality assumptions, there's a case to be made that the group ought to compromise, and it ought to compromise when the compromise option is everyone's second favorite choice, when it's like a good compromise, but that the group shouldn't compromise when it's that they don't have a legitimacy reason stemming from legitimacy and rationality to compromise when it's everyone's least favorite compromise. Now, what if that mixed case that I said we'd set aside at the beginning, the one where some people it's their second favorite, other people it's their second least favorite? In that case, I believe all three options would be permissible. Or at least this sort of line of argument doesn't say anything. There might be other lines of argument that say that they should pick the compromise in that case or whatever. But the point is that this argument leaves all three permissible, doesn't rule anything out in those cases. Okay, so that is the conclusion of the talk. That's the consensus and compromise and collective choice. The takeaway message is that I think there's an argument to be made that groups do have reasons to compromise in certain situations, those reasons stemming from certain rationality assumptions and certain assumptions about legitimacy. Cool, thank you.